Palantir, I think, is about 20 or 30% women these days, and I wish it was more than 20 or 30%, but it's definitely not all men. I think if you're all men, it means, usually if someone hires all men, it means that you had usually socially awkward guys building a company who didn't know enough women, because if they knew women, they'd definitely find really smart women to hire, because there are a lot of really smart women out there who are very qualified. There are, in my opinion, fewer women than I wish there were in computer science departments, but there's enough of them out there that if you're not hiring them, you're probably not looking hard enough. And this is mainly a problem with small companies, just in my experience, not because they're sexist, but because they just know more people who are like them. And so sometimes when you start with a few friends who happen to be guys, you do that way. One of our companies started with a few girls and hired a bunch more women. It was kind of funny. It was like all women, and people asking if they're sexist against guys, and like, no, we just hired our smartest friends. So sometimes the opposite happens too, but it's a big problem where people don't know enough people in the other gender, and I think it's worth reaching out and trying to do that. One of our really strong companies was started by a few of the best programmers out of Stanford that happen to be men and hired their friends. They've really actively spent a lot of time now the last few months, like bringing in some really talented women as well, and it was something they actually decided to do because they thought it was the right thing to do and it's better for their company. And so I think it's become an issue a lot more because we're talking about and trying to address in Silicon Valley at this point. I'm proud to see how this sector has responded very positively to try to make sure we're getting this right, but we're still all learning a lot. I'm obsessed with the fact that the regulatory state is by far the most important policy issue in America today. And there's a few different reasons why, but the one high-level reason is, we've written a lot about the future of labor, and I also am concerned about how many jobs we're going to disrupt over the next 30, 40 years. I do think we're going to, if you look at America the last 300 years, every 90 years we've killed about half the jobs. That's a good thing, right? You actually couldn't make society wealthier if you didn't get rid of jobs like that, because what that means is you're raising productivity. Like if you wanted more jobs, you could ban farm tools. We'd all have to be farmers, and we'd all have jobs, but we'd all be really poor, right? So it's actually a good thing to get rid of jobs. But if you get rid of a lot of them at once, and those people don't get their jobs, it's really bad. So if you look at how this works, the regulatory states become very, very complicated, and it actually massively slows down economic growth and job creation when you get this thing that makes too many rules and too many bureaucrats in charge. And so right now every state has like 9 million words in its regulatory code, and so as we disrupt all these jobs, as we're probably going to do, I can talk about why. You guys have all already read about this, I don't need to tell you why, but if you imagine we're going to get rid of half of the jobs and raise productivity a lot, hopefully in the next 30, 40 years, what are these people going to do? Well, if you want to create more jobs, you need a really, really flexible economy that's able to try things and it's able to iterate. And if you don't have that, to me, it's a really big problem. And so that's a kind of very high level I can go a lot deeper on, but I think fixing the regulatory state is going to be key to helping keep our whole society sustainable and healthy over the next few decades, and that's something I'm really focused on. I was lucky to have a lot of good advice when I was getting going, and maybe something I wish I'd done more of even is when I was in college, when I was coming out of college, I'd study these areas and have opinions about them, and I started writing to different people who were being very successful in those areas and telling them my opinion and asking them to meet and asking them to give me advice on what I was thinking of doing. And I wish I'd even done more of that, because that's partially how I met Peter. Actually, at the time he wasn't as famous as he is now, but at the time I met a bunch of other high net worth individuals. I decided to work with Peter out of like the 20 or so I met. But having met those 20 different people who were each people who built big things in different areas, I learned a lot about how the world worked from each of them. And so I think that's something I haven't actually done in a while, but when I was that age, I did a bunch of that, and that was extremely helpful. And like building those relationships and continuing to learn from people who have been successful, I think is really important. One of the things that struck me with some of the companies we were talking about earlier, I was talking to people today, and very few people I think have reached out to the leaders in their fields, which I think is a really important thing to make sure to do. I always think whatever makes your brain more interested is a better use of your time, because it's going to make you more successful in life. One of the people I really enjoyed meeting in the last few years was the world chess champion Magnus Carlsen, and I was a state chess champion when I was younger, so not nearly as good as Magnus, but I was really into chess for a while when I was much younger. And I asked him how he studied. I was really curious, and his teacher gives him about 60 hours of homework a week. His different teachers, but he only does the 30 hours of it that he thinks is interesting, and then he spends twice so much time on that, basically. So I thought that was kind of a fun example where the best person in the world, this thing is making sure he's only doing things where his mind is like really engaged and really fascinated by it. I think it's just probably a good rule for life in general, is try to focus on areas where your mind's engaged and where you're going to be stimulated. Is probably the right thing, is my bias. Well, intellectual curiosity probably is a really big part of it. I think most people who have been really successful have their own opinions, and and have like taken something they're interested in and gone and studied it uniquely and kind of done that. But I think the thing that strikes me the most though is how different all these people are. Like Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen, for example, are two very, very different people, come from different ends of the spectrum on how venture capital works and how companies are built. It's fascinating. Peter doesn't want to compete at all. Mark wants to crush his competitors. He's on the board of OpenGov, and it's really useful to have, to go through this with him and hear his point of view, which for me is very different than how I was originally working with Peter. Mark has this giant operational team that does all these things for the companies, and is really mapping everything out really, really well, deep in the metrics. Whereas Founders Fund is, Peter's biggest fund is much more just purely intellectual, sitting around with a small group thinking about how the world should work, and they're both very successful, right? So I think what's fascinating is how many different ways there are to be successful in the world. There's not any really single path, but I do think all of them share a really fierce intellectual curiosity, and they develop their opinions about the world. I have really enjoyed recently, in the last couple of years, this book, Evolution of Everything, by Matt Ridley. Matt Ridley is a controversial author. He's a Viscount in the House of Lords these days, actually, but he's an intellectual, really interesting guy from England. And I think that the idea of how systems work and system-level thinking is very unintuitive to most people, and so understanding how some things like evolution apply to lots of different areas and apply to how markets work and industries work, to me, I think it's something that I wish people had a better intuition for, something that's probably one of them. In my career, most of what I've done has been very, very focused on impact. And so after 9/11, it was a pretty scary time where we felt like the country was under attack, and we saw the current president in charge wasn't really a technologist, nor were the people around him. And so we suddenly spent tens of billions of dollars on this software that was just really, really bad. Not only were they violating civil liberties, but they were wasting money, and they were way behind what my friends had done in Silicon Valley. And so we said, wow, we can save the country with billions or tens of billions of dollars. We can make sure we protect civil liberties. Yeah, we can help get the bad guys. That seems like a really important mission. And I think that's why we were able to attract a lot of the best technologists, because it was something everyone wanted to be focused on. Similar with, now with the out-of-part OpenGov. OpenGov, we're in 2,000 cities now, helping them see their budgets, helping them see what they're spending money on, helping them try to save money by comparing and learning from each other, engaging citizens. So most of what we like to do with our fund, if you look at the mission on APC's site, it's all about how can we work together to solve problems in the world, and how can we do that? How can we use businesses to do that? And so I think for the type of stuff we do, it tends to be on average more profitable if it's solving a real problem, because that means it's something that everyone's going to want to work on and everyone's going to want to adopt. And there is sometimes in business a conflict. I think especially like in tobacco and alcohol and sin businesses and gambling and probably other ones as well. Probably certain parts of healthcare, the incentives are wrong and people make more money like for certain pharma companies doing the wrong thing, and that really bothers me. Like our pharma company thing we're working on is trying to get lower drug prices to everyone. It's called Blink Health. So I think there are ways you can work as technologists and focus on doing things that help. I personally wouldn't want to be invested in a company that I thought was making the world a worse place. Like I have enough money anyway, why would I want to do that? So that's kind of how we approach it as a team.